So our reading is The Mystery of Marie Rogêt. And it's often subtitled as a sequel to the murders in the Rue Morgue, which we gave a plot summary of last week. It was written in 1842, and this is the first murder mystery based on details of a real crime. It first appeared in Snowden's Lady's Companion in 3 installments, November and December in 1842 and February 1843. And Poe refers to it as one of his tales of logic. So, a very brief sketch, plot summary. Poe's detective character, C. Auguste Dupin, and his assistant, an unnamed narrator, undertake the unsolved murder of Marie Rogêt in Paris. The body of Rogêt, a perfume shop employee, is found in the River Seine, and the press takes a keen interest in the mystery. Dupin remarks that the newspapers create a sensation rather than to further the cause of truth. Even so, he uses the newspaper reports to get into the mind of the murderer. Dupin rejects the popular theory, blaming the murder on a gang of ruffians seen in the area around the time of Rogêt's disappearance. One of such a group, he reasons, would have certainly confessed to the crime due to the fear of betrayal rather than a bothered conscience. Using the known facts of the case, Dupin further determines that a single murderer was involved. This person was probably a sailor and dragged the victim by the cloth belt around her waist at first, then switched to a cloth around her neck before dumping the body off a boat into the river. Finding the boat, Dupin suggests, will lead the police to the murderer. The narrative is based upon the actual murder of Marie Cecilia Rogers. Rogers was presumably born in Lyme, Connecticut in 1820, though her birth records have not survived. She disappeared on October 4th, 1838 in New York City. Working at a tobacco shop, she was regarded as attractive by the male clientele and thus became known as the beautiful cigar girl. Only a few days later, the newspapers announced her return. It was said she had eloped with a naval officer. 3 years later, on July 25th, 1841, she disappears again. Her body was found floating in the Hudson River in Hoboken, New Jersey, which is right next to New York City. The details surrounding the case suggested she was murdered. The death of this well-known woman received national attention for weeks. Months later, the inquest still ongoing, her fiancé was found dead, an act of suicide. By his side, a remorseful note and an empty bottle of poison were found. Writing about Rogers as a sequel to the murders of the Rue Morgue, Poe tried to solve the after aforementioned enigma by creating a murder story. As Poe wrote in a letter in 1842, under the pretense of showing how Dupin unraveled the mystery of Marie's assassination, I, in fact, enter into a very rigorous analysis of the real tragedy in New York. He situated the narrative in Paris using the details of the original tragedy. Although there was intense media interest in memorializing of a sort by Poe, the crime remains one of the most puzzling unsolved murders of New York City. Fictionalized actual events, especially murder, was common in this period of American literature. Poe had previously fictionalized the so-called Beauchamp shop tragedy in his only play, Politician, which was left uncompleted in 1835. The sensational murder story was also fictionalized by several other writers, including William Gilmore Simms and Thomas Hawley Cheevers. The mystery of Marie Rogêt, however, was likely the first real-life crime turned into a detective story. Okay, so let's go with a quick summary of the story you're going to read. We'll bring you along. And the mystery of Marie Rogêt from mantex.com UK. So the story follows the formula Poe devised from the murders in the Rue Morgue. An unnamed narrator presents the hero Detective Dupin as a somewhat world-weary bohemian with an outstanding intellect. Dupin is then landed with the difficult problem of a crime which the police cannot solve. The structure of the story then follows essentially two parts: the presentation of the evidence, then the analysis of the facts. Marie Rogêt disappears, then her corpse is found in the Seine. Everyone is baffled by the problem. Dupin examines all the evidence related to the crime, then speculates on possible explanations. There is a missing third part of the story, which makes itself quite noticeably felt. We don't know if Dupin's interpretations of events is correct or not. He draws up a list of what might be the solutions to the mystery. His conclusion is that further investigations might confirm the veracity of his speculations, but we do not know if these theories are valid or not. That is the major weakness of this story, and the reason why it is not so successful as its companion pieces, The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter. But in drawing up his explanations for what might have happened, Poe makes some interesting observations which might throw light onto a secondary subject of the story, which is the character Dupin himself. He has a fresh and original way of looking at evidence. The proper question in this case, such as that it is not so much what has occurred as what has occurred that has never occurred before. He also makes plain a scathing critique of the newspapers and superficial journalism which runs through all of Dupin's stories. Not only are the police incompetent in failing to solve the crimes, but the newspapers merely highlight sensational details to increase their sales. The irresponsible highlighting of these graphic details actually obscures the truth of what really happened in the crime and impedes its solution. This critique of the press irresponsibility was made more than 150 years ago and may be regarded as still valid today. We should bear that in mind in general. It is the object of our newspapers rather to create a sensation, to make a point, than to further the cause of truth. The main problem with this tale as a short story is that it lacks any sense of dramatic movement, and it certainly doesn't have a genuine resolution. There is no active pursuit of a criminal. All activity relating to the crime has already been taken place before the story begins, and we do not know if Dupin's suppositions are valid or not. As the critic Howard Haycraft observed, the characters neither move nor speak. These weaknesses arise from the very origins of the story. Poe wrote the tale when the mysterious crime was still fresh in the public's mind. He also promoted the story as his own original solution to the mystery. It was even published in 2 parts. But the fact is that the crime has not been solved. Indeed, it never has been solved. However, the story does have the distinction of being the first detective murder mystery based on a real-life crime. So let's get into the story a little bit here. A synopsis. Following Auguste Dupin's success in solving mysteries of the murders in the Rue Morgue, his fame spreads among the Parisian police. The attractive Marie Rogêt lives with her widowed mother, who keeps a pension. Marie works in a perfume shop in the Palace Royal, owned by M. Leblanc. Marie suddenly disappears for a week, then returns home, then disappears a second time, after which her corpse is found floating in the River Seine. The police are baffled. A reward is offered, then doubled a week later. After a month, the chief of the prefecture visits Dupin with a request for help to save his reputation and honor. The narrator then gathers dispositions and newspaper reports of the crime. Her body was badly mutilated. She was interred, then exhumed for further investigation. Public outrage rose as time passed without results. It is suggested that the body might be that of somebody else. An outsider, M. Bravis, takes a close interest in identifying the body, although a friend of his identifies it sooner. The newspapers throw direct suspicion on M. Bravis, but he protests his innocence. Some boys find remains of clothing in the woods and a handkerchief bearing the name Marie Rogêt. The landlady of a nearby tavern reports the appearance of a young man and woman. There are screams later. Then the dead body of Marie Rogêt is found in the same spot, along with a suicide note. Dupin is severely critical of the newspapers and police. He submits the text of one journalist's report to close critical examination and goes into a detailed account of the physics of the bodies drowning in water. He is particularly scathing about the journalistic generalizations, cliches, and sloppy reasoning. Dupin thinks it's necessary to look outside the immediate events of the mystery. He digs up several news reports which at first seem unrelated to the mystery. He analyzes the garments found at the crime scene and argues that they have been planted there. Then he compares the likelihood of a single murderer with that of a gang. So, initially, they thought it was a gang of boys who came into a local restaurant, caused a ruckus, didn't pay the bill, ran off. The owner of that restaurant was really promoting the fact that she thought the murder was committed by those gang of ruffians. His analysis of the evidence points to the conclusion that the murderer must have been the sailor with whom Marie Rogêt previously eloped. He suggests that further interviews could be conducted with this in mind. The narrator concludes with a comparison of the real historic crime of Marie Rogers and then further reflections on chance and possibility. Poe was really trying to do with the story was to solve a mystery of Mary Rogers that happened in New York. And it wasn't unusual for authors to take real life situations, cases, and so forth, and turn them into a fiction story. So this is an article from the American Aquarian Society by Angela Serratore, and it's about a teenage beauty turned up dead in the Hudson River, which is in New York. Even the godfather of detective fiction couldn't figure out who did it. And it's an actual case that has never really been solved. But Angela has a unique perspective to it, some additional information that we didn't have before. And this is her analysis. This is from the SmithsonianMagazine.com. So, John Anderson's Liberty Street cigar shop was no different from the dozens of other tobacco emporiums frequented by the newspapermen of New York City. There was only one reason it was so crowded, and that was because of Mary Rogers. Mary was the teenage daughter of a widowed boarding house keeper, and her beauty was the stuff of legend. A poem dedicated to her beauty appeared in the New York Herald, and during her time clerking at John Anderson's shop, she bestowed her heavenly smile upon writers like James Cooper and Washington Irving, who would visit to smoke and flirt during their breaks from their offices nearby. In 1838, the cigar girl with the dainty figure and pretty face, went out and failed to return. Her mother discovered what appeared to be a suicide note. The New York Sun reported that the coroner had examined the letter and concluded the author had a fixed and unalterable determination to destroy herself. But a few days later, Mary returned home, alive and well. She had been, it turned out, visiting a friend in Brooklyn. The Sun, which 3 years earlier had been responsible for the Great Moon hoax, was accused of manufacturing Mary's disappearance to sell newspapers. Her boss, John Anderson, was suspected of being in on the scheme, and after Mary returned, his shop was busier than ever. Still, the affair blew over and Mary settled back into her role as an object of admiration for New York's literary set. By 1841, she was engaged to Daniel Pine, a cork cutter and boarder in her mother's house. On Sunday, July 25th, Mary announced plans to visit relatives in New Jersey and told Payne and her mother that she'd be back the next day. The night Mary ventured out, a severe storm hit New York, and when Mary failed to return the next morning, her mother assumed she'd gotten caught in bad weather and delayed her trip home. By Monday night, Mary still hadn't come back, and her mother was concerned enough to place an advertisement in the following day's Sun asking for anyone who might have seen Mary to have the girl contact her, as it is supposed some accident has befallen her. Foul play was not suspected. On July 28, some men were out for a stroll near Sybil's Cave, a bucolic Hudson riverside spot in Hoboken, New Jersey, when a bobbing figure caught their attention. Rowing out in a small boat, they dragged what turned out to be the body of a young woman back to shore. Crowds gathered, and within hours, a former fiancé of Mary's identified the body as hers. According to the coroner, her dress and hat were torn, and her body looked as though it had taken a beating. She was also, the coroner took care to note, not pregnant, and had evidently been a person of chastity and correct habits. Questions abounded. Had Mary been killed by someone she knew? Had she been a victim of a random crime opportunity? Something New Yorkers increasingly worried about as their city grew and young women strayed farther and farther from the family parlor. Why hadn't the police of New York or Hoboken spotted Mary and her attacker? The Herald, the Sun, and the Tribune all put Mary on the front pages, and no detail was too lurid. Graphic descriptions of Mary's body appeared in each paper. Although with vivid theories about what her killer or killers might have done to her, more than anything, they demanded answers. Suspicion fell immediately upon Daniel Payne, Mary's fiancé. Perhaps one or the other had threatened to leave, and Payne killed her. either to get rid of her or to prevent her from breaking their engagement. He produced an airtight alibi for his whereabouts during Mary's disappearance. But that didn't stop the New Yorker, a publication unrelated to the current magazine of that name, from suggesting in August of 1841 that he'd had a hand in Mary's death. There is one point in Mr. Paine's testimony which is worthy of remark. It seems he had been searching for Miss Rogers, his betrothed, 2 or 3 days, yet when he was informed on Wednesday evening that her body had been found at Hoboken, he did not go to see it or inquire into the matter. In fact, it appears that he never went at all, though he had been there inquiring for her before. This is odd and should be explained. If Paine hadn't killed Mary, it was theorized, she'd been caught by a gang of criminals. This idea was given further credence later that August when 2 Hoboken boys were out in the woods collecting sassafras for their mother, a tavern owner named Frederica Loss. They happened upon several items of women's clothing. The Herald reported that the clothes had all evidently been there at least 3 or 4 weeks. They were all mildewed, down hard. The grass had grown around them and over them. The scarf and the petticoat were crumpled up as if in a struggle. The most suggestive item was a handkerchief embroidered with the initials M.R. The discovery of the clothes capitulated Loss into minor celebrity. She spoke with reporters at length about Mary, whom she claimed to have seen in the company of a tall, dark stranger on the evening of July 25th. The 2 had ordered lemonade and then taken their leave from Loss's tavern. Later that night, she said, she heard a scream coming from the woods. At the time, she thought it was one of her sons, but after going out to investigate and finding her boys safely inside, she decided it must have been an animal. In light of the clothing discovery so close to her tavern, though, she now felt certain it had come from Mary. The Herald and other papers took this as evidence that strangers had indeed absconded with Mary, but despite weeks of breathless speculation, no further clues were found and no subjects identified. The city moved on, and Mary's story became yesterday's news, only to return to the headlines. In October 1841, Daniel Paine went on a drinking binge that carried him to Hoboken. After spending October 7th going from tavern to tavern to tavern, he entered a pharmacy and bought a vial of landium. He stumbled down to where Mary's body had been brought to the shore, collapsed onto a bench, and died, leaving behind a note, quote, "To the world, here I am on the very spot. May God forgive me for my misspent life," end quote. The consensus was that his heart had been broken. While newspapers had their way with Mary's life and death, Edgar Allan Poe turned to fact-based fiction to make sense of the case. Working in the spring of 1842, Edgar Allan Poe transported Mary's tale to Paris, and in The Mystery of Marie Rogêt, gave her a slightly more francophone name and a job in a perfume shop. But the details otherwise match exactly. The opening of Poe's story makes his intent clear. The extraordinary details which I am now called upon to make public will be brought to form. As regards sequence of time, the primary branch of a series of scarcely intelligible coincidences, whose secondary or concluding branch will be recognized by all readers in the late murder of Mary Cecilia Rogers at New York. A sequel to The Murders in the Rue Morgue, widely considered the first detective story ever set to print, The Mystery of Marie Rogêt, would see Detective Dupin solve the young woman's murder. In shopping the story to editors, Poe suggested he'd gone beyond mere storytelling. Under the pretense of showing how Dupin unraveled the mystery of Marie's assassination, I, in fact, enter into a very rigorous analysis of the real tragedy in New York. Though he appropriated the details of Marie's story, Poe still faced the real challenge of actually solving the murder when the police were no closer than they'd been in July 1841. Like many other stories of the mid-19th century, The Mystery of Marie Rogêt was serialized, appearing in the November issue of Snowden's Ladies' Companion. The third part, in which Dupin put together the details of the crime but left the identity of the criminal up in the air, was to appear at the end of the month, but a shocking piece of news delayed the final installment. In October 1842, Frederica Loss, the tavern owner, was accidentally shot by one of her sons and made a deathbed confession regarding Mary Rogers. The tall, dark man she'd seen the girl with in July 1841 had not been a stranger. She knew him. The Tribune reported on the Sunday of Miss Rogers' disappearance, she came to her house from this city in company with a young physician who undertook to produce for her a premature delivery. A premature delivery being a euphemism for abortion. The procedure had gone wrong, Loss said, and Mary had died. After disposing of her body in the river, one of Loss's sons had thrown her clothes in a neighbor's pond, and then, after having second thoughts, scattered them in the woods. While Loss's confession did not entirely match the evidence, there was still the matter of Mary's body, which bore signs of some kind of struggle. The Tribune seemed satisfied. Thus has this fearful mystery, which has struck fear and terror to so many hearts, been at least explained by circumstances in which no one can fail to perceive a providential agency. To some, the attribution of Mary's death to a botched abortion made perfect sense, and it had been suggested that she and Payne quarreled over an unwanted pregnancy, and in the early 1840s New York City was fervently debating the activities of the abortionist Madame Ristel. Several penny presses that linked Rogers to Ristel and suggested that her 1838 disappearance lasted precisely as long as it would take a woman to terminate a pregnancy in secret and return undiscovered. And while that connection was ultimately unsubstantiated, Mary was on the minds of New Yorkers when, in 1845, they officially criminalized the procedure. Poe was considered a sorry follow-up to the murders in the Rue Morgue, but he did manage to work Loss's story into his narrative. His Marie Roget had indeed kept company with a swarthy naval officer who may very well have killed her, though by what means we are not sure. Did he murder her outright or lead her into a fatal accident, a plan of concealment? Officially, the death of Marie Rogers seems unsolved. Poe's account remains the most widely read, and his hints at abortion made even clearer in 1845 reprinting of the story, though the word abortion never appears, have for most closed the case. Still, those looking for Poe to put Mary Rogers' case to rest are left to their own devices. In a letter to a friend, Poe wrote, "Nothing was omitted in Marie Roget but what I admitted myself. All that is mystification." Okay, so that's another take on the story of the mystery of Marie Roget, which relates to a real story about Marie Rogers.